We're ready for this, Emily. It's your crew. It's your crew.
It's my crew.
That's right, me and my crew. So let's welcome members of the First Canada Youth Council onto the show, starting off with a student on First Team 7712, ACC and Umoja. We got Maria. Hello, Maria. Welcome back. We were just here like last week, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, I have a
seems like
co-host.
only a little bit of time has passed, but I'm happy to be back.
We are glad to have you here. Also, we have student on First Team 7480, Machine Mavericks, a member of the First Headquarters International Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Advisory Council, and of course, the First Canada Youth Council. We have Namira.
Hello, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Namira. And you're going to be co-hosting next week.
Yes, I'm so excited because I haven't been on since March, so I'm really looking forward to it.
We are excited. We got like the past, the present, the future of the co-hosts right now, so that's really neat. And of course, student on First Team 4939. She helped run the First Canada STEMathon this summer, which was just an amazing event. We have Mahak D.
Hello, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, welcome back, Mahak. Glad to have you on the show. We've got a great group here. And so we're talking equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think yourselves and the Youth Council have put together a little bit of a slideshow to get us going.
Yes, that's correct.
Take it away.
Awesome. Maria, would you like to get us started there?
Sure. So to begin this discussion, we kind of wanted to make sure everyone was on a level playing field, given as we are talking about ED&I, and we know that these discussions are new to a lot of people. So we wanted to start with defining a few important terms that we might reference throughout our answers and throughout our segment tonight. So first, for performative activism. So performative activism is defined as activism done to increase one's social capital or one's level of social acceptability rather than one's devotion to the cause. So one example of this that many of you might be familiar with is the black square that was posted back in back in June on a Tuesday that was supposed to be Blackout Tuesday. This was viewed as performative activism because a lot of the people, some people who posted the square stopped there and didn't continue to do any learning and reflect on some of their own biases or help support the Black Lives Matter cause further. Another important term that we'll be discussing tonight is intersectionality. And intersectionality, if you kind of want to think of it as the word like intersection, so it basically means the different identities that somebody might possess. So for example, this could be like a racial category you're part of, this could be a gender identity you align with, this could be a sexual orientation you align with, all those intersections that kind of create the identity that you live with on a daily basis. So those are the two terms I'm going to define, and I'll just pass it over to Namira to do some of the other ones.
Awesome. Thanks, Maria. I think those were some really great explanations. And I feel as though with approaching equity, diversity, inclusion, especially back in June, when I think a lot of these conversations were starting up, I started hearing all these new terms. And I was like, I've never heard these before. What do these mean? And so one of those terms was Slacktivism. I was thinking about the platform Slack, and I was like, what does this have to do with anything here? But it's pretty similar to what Maria was talking about in terms of performative activism. So it's where you're kind of engaging in doing something where you're not fully devoted to making a change with what you're doing. So that could be like the black square, for instance, but it's really just being an activist, not because you really care about the issue, but perhaps because others are doing it, which makes sense sometimes. There's always like a sense of conformity and peer pressure, I think, that exists with social issues, for instance. But it's really important to consider what you're posting, consider what you're vouching for, what you're advocating for, and what you believe in as well. I know that the past few months have been a big time of reflection for me, and so it's given me a lot of time to think about, well, what do I really care about, and how can I create goals, or what steps can I take to meet my goals in terms of being or engaging in allyship. And learning about equity, diversity, inclusion. And something else that we wanted to mention here was this term mixed race. And so I used to use this when I was younger because I had some friends who, for example, had a Black parent and a white parent, or maybe they had a Chinese parent and an Indian parent, for instance. And so we would often use this term mixed race. And I didn't realize that it was problematic until really just a few months ago, because the term mixed race, when you think about it, and I don't really like saying it, but I'm just saying it for the purpose of this, but it's really just, it seems as though you're referring to a thing. When you refer to something being mixed, you're not really referring to people, you're referring to objects. And it sort of implies, I guess, the opposite of mixed, where someone might be like pure. You might also think of dogs, for example, where it's like a mixed breed or a pure breed, and that is not how we talk about humans. It's definitely a very dehumanizing term. And I had never thought about this before until I encountered this, and I thought, you know what, that is a term that we shouldn't be using. And so something else that might be a bit more inclusive of this concept of race and referring to humans as humans would be multiracial. And so that's usually a better term. I know that there are a couple of terms that have been used by different people in different places, but I've learned that multiracial is a really good one in terms of referring to the fact that it's sort of like intersectionality, where you have different aspects of your identity, this specifically discussing your racial identity, that make up you. And I think now I'll pass it on to Mahak.
Yeah, so since this is an equity, diversity, and inclusion panel, we really want to take a few minutes to unpack what equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, really is. We speak a lot about it in our FIRST community, and it's one of our core values, especially when we're doing outreach and other initiatives at competitions as well. But for myself specifically, I never really understood equity, diversity, and inclusion until I got onto the youth council. And I think sometimes this is a mistake that all of us might make, because we don't really understand exactly how this can be implemented into either our FIRST team or just our life in general. So we really want to take a few minutes to just understand like what each term means. So equity, for example, refers to like the fair and respectful treatment of all people. So this means that we do everything we can to identify and eliminate any unfair biases, stereotypes, or barriers that may be present that may limit like the full potential. So for example, since we are talking about education in this panel, that may be present in our education system. And more often than not, we confuse equity and equality. But one way that I like to remember it is that equity is the process versus equality is the result. So equality is really what we're trying to gain versus equity is like the process that we might take. So for example, my team really looks at equity as the process, equality is the result when we think about our outreach events. And then diversity refers to a demographic mix of the community. So with a focus on representing equity, deserving groups. So equity is sort of incorporated in both like diversity and inclusion is the creation of an environment where everyone feels welcomed and is treated with respect, and is able to fully participate. And another example I kind of want to bring up is that this is actually a really good example that I use to understand the difference between diversity and inclusion, is that when you invite someone to a party, that's diversity, but asking them to dance is inclusion. So I know I love dancing, this is why I brought it up. But
TikTok dancer.
I know, a renegade for life. But I guess like this is a really great way to really make sure that you aren't really looking at like how many girls are in the room. But for example, when we look at women in STEM, like we just talked about during the scholarship panel discussion, but also whether they feel included and they're participating and feel like their voices are being heard. So this is very important that we really recognize this and make sure it's implemented and understand what's going on. But I think we can sort of move on to a discussion. Oh, Namira, feel free to go ahead.
A discussion with Namira. This next slide here is something that we felt pretty passionate about when we were discussing, I guess, our learning in the past few months. And I think that this presentation is a product of that learning. We just want to be sharing what we've learned in the past and to continue to learn as a community. So I know that growing up, I used to always use the term visible minority or minority when referring to, I mean, myself, for example, as a brown person who grew up in a community that was predominantly white, for instance, or how I'd refer to some of my friends, for instance. And I think that that's what we heard a lot in the news and in social media, and we always referred to certain people being minorities. But what I've recently learned just within really the past year or so is that the term minority isn't always accurate to the situation of people who are represented in a group. And it also has a sort of center around whiteness. And what I mean by that is this term visible minority might imply that you can see differences in race, which you can't always see. And I think that this relates as well to the concept of being multiracial. I have a number of friends who are Black, so they grew up with one Black parent and one white parent, for instance, but they look white. And so they're treated based on their visual appearance, but there are a lot of parts of their identity that you can't just see from looking at them. And I think that makes sense for any part of your identity. You should never really judge a book by its cover, so to say. But I think something that's been really interesting for me is to learn about these terms and why to not use people of color, for instance, because again, that's something that's very centered around one group of people, where a better term to use might be racialization. And this is something that I sort of learned through my school board, because we were discussing what terminology to move forward or moving forward. And then also the HQ EDI Council, where in the US, for example, people of color is a really common term, but something that we've started to use in Canada is racialization. I think that this somewhat refers, or it somewhat connects to what Mahak was talking about in terms of a process or a state, where racialization is this whole process of being defined by some characteristics because of your race. So these could be physical characteristics, or they could be more like your personality, for instance, but it's really just based on one part of your identity, but it's just that it's revealing this process here instead of just being a state that's there. And then racism would be the social construction, which we can talk about in a second, of superiority or inferiority, so power relations based on these previously determined characteristics. And I know that was a lot of big words to start off there, but it's really just to say something that we really want to express here is that race is a social construct, in that we shouldn't be defining people just by our physical characteristics. And I think a great example of this that I learned not too long ago was that in the early ages of, I guess, the United States, when there were Italians and there were Jewish people and Irish people as well, they weren't considered white. Whereas nowadays, if you look at an Irish person, for example, they look white, but they were actually categorized as a different race. So they're non-white and sort of put into a similar group, again, why we shouldn't be categorizing people based on these characteristics as Black people, as African Americans then. And so that's really interesting to me, but then it's also important to look at a sort of spectrum of color as well, and why you can't just say that one Black person will be treated the same as another Black person, because you have people who have lighter skin or darker skin within different communities. I know I'm South Asian, so I know within the South Asian community, there's unfortunately a prevalence of colorism, where people might discriminate based on how light or how dark you are. And there are a lot of different roots to that, but in the end, it's really important to realize that racialized is a good term to use, or at least a term that I'm definitely most comfortable with, because it implies this process of social construction based on race. And racism, unfortunately, is what we often refer to as these discriminatory practices, which can become very extreme. But that's because of this process of racialization, and because of sort of having a sense of inferiority or superiority depending on who you are in relation to the people around you. So we just thought that that would be interesting to discuss, because I know I'd never heard the term racialized before 2020. I think I'd always said, visible minorities or something similar. But it is really important to realize that there's more to a person than just the color of their skin, or how curly their hair is, or how they speak, or how they act. There's so many different parts to them that make them a person. And that's, again, the concept of intersectionality.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And thanks for sharing those definitions and giving us some background. Because I think, number one, we can all learn, as like Namira said, she learned about this in 2020. So those of you who out there who are watching are feeling like, well, I don't know. I don't know what words to say, what words are okay. It's like, that's okay. We're all learning, and it's about making the effort, and it's about trying to learn. And it's about, you talked about slacktivism, you talked about performative activism. So let's move beyond just say, putting a black square, but doing some research and learning about these terms. And when you encounter a term that you're not sure about, let's look it up. Let's go to Google, or let's ask someone who knows, ask a trusted teacher, ask a trusted mentor. And if they say, oh, I don't know, then let's look it up together. That's one of my favorite things. When someone asks me something I don't know, it's like, I don't know either, but let's go figure it out as together. On racialization, it's really interesting. The example that I find most curious is when you look back at the Rwandan genocide. in the early 90s, the Hutsis and the Hutus, those were completely socially constructed groups. Those groups didn't exist before Europeans arrived in Africa, and they made those groups up because it was easier for them to administer the awfulness that colonialism was at that time. So again, it's just some of these things that we take for granted as, oh, well, that's the way it is. It's actually social constructs. And so thank you so much for sharing all of that. But I know when you all came on the show today, you wanted to talk about what's happening in schools and how is this impacting schools? Because guess what? First students are in schools, well, you know, some of the time they're in virtual school. But obviously, this year, 2020 was pivotal when we talk about the journey of anti-racism with the Black Lives Matters protests in June, which was, you know, focusing some incredibly awful injustices that happened, and not just injustices that happened right then and there, injustices that have been happening for centuries. So, but how have those protests affected young people? Specifically, have you noticed changes in your schools?
Maria, would you like to get us started there?
Sure. And I don't want to go back for too long, but I just want to differentiate quickly between social construct and not real. So when we say that race is a social construct, we mean to say that it was made up and agreed upon by human society. However, as Namir was mentioning with racialization versus racism, that doesn't mean that race itself doesn't have material consequences. And they can range from like small microaggressions to like extreme violent acts, such as what was seen in May, and then the resulting protests that were against said violent action in June. So it is important to like realize that, yes, it does have an effect, but it is, again, made up, and that's not necessarily the way that you should always be defining people, although it does have real life consequences. Yes, but to answer the question,
can I interrupt you for 1 second, Maria, before you answer the question? I love what
Sure.
you just did there, because that's how the learning process evolves. You know, like we're all trying to, this is new stuff. We're trying to figure it out. And so it's important for people, when you have knowledge, and if something is, you know, slightly misinterpreted, make sure it gets clarified. And it's okay. Number one, it's okay to clarify things for people. Number two, it's okay when someone clarifies for you. It's not like it's an attack or like you don't know what you're talking about. It's just like, hey, let's all learn together. So I loved that. And I love how the youth council is so good at that. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's that, especially when I remember when I was first learning about like the term social construct, it was kind of confusing me a little bit. So I thought I wanted to maybe clarify it for others, or maybe I can. But in terms of how my school has changed personally, I know there was a lot of outcry from students at my school, because I know a lot of students, at least in my grade, are very politically involved. So what was started was a diversity council. So we have meetings every third Friday where we we discuss an education piece. So it could be like, for example, something recent would be like, we'll give a little bit of information on École Polytechnique and the recent National Remembrance Day of Violence Against Women. And then we'll go into an action piece, so like what actions people can take against certain injustices that are happening at the moment. So one example of an action we did was about the violence that was happening against big back fishermen in Nova Scotia. So we did we gave people resources on how they could help the fishermen there. And then we'll go into like discussions about maybe a topic of the day. So it could be something about like cultural appropriation. I know we had a discussion about that over Halloween, but we'll try and have these meetings to give both students and staff a space to discuss these issues, or discuss action items that can be taken, and how they can apply that to their lives, both inside and outside of school. And then as well, my school is piloting a new program. I believe it's called Name Coach. And basically you can pronounce your name and then you can create an account, pronounce your name, and then you can attach that to the end of your email. So people will be able to hear how your name is pronounced, which will hopefully help with mitigating the mispronunciation of different names. But yeah, so those are the two big things my school has been doing.
Mahak, would you like to go next?
Yes, I guess I can go next. But I guess I just wanted to add on before I begin that while we were preparing for this panel discussion, I was able to learn a lot about all these terms that we just mentioned, and then also just like how to be an active learner, especially when it comes to social justice issues. And I know since May and June, I've been able to reflect a lot on myself and my own just like the lens that I look at different issues from. And then when it comes to my school, discussions have begun within our classroom. However, not a lot of change has been, I haven't seen a lot of change just yet. And then also because my school is mainly made up of brown and black students. So we have an advanced placement program, so a regional program at my school. My school is based in a very like low income area. So that's like a lot of the students who are a part of this regional program are mainly brown students versus those who are in the academic or applied stream or black students. Because of this like AP versus academic and applied, there's already this divide present. However, a lot of student-led initiatives and clubs have begun at my school. So for example, we have an Interact club, and for the month of September and October, they focused a lot on the Black Lives Matter movement as well as EDI within our school. So they had different panel discussions, they put out social media posts because of the current situation that we're in, that really like looked at different terms and terminologies that we use and also applied it to our own learning within our classrooms. And I just found out that today my school had an equity seminar, which I heard was very informative and amazing. So I'm really excited for it because it did half our school today, and I guess my classroom is going to be attending the seminar tomorrow, so I'm really looking forward to that. But those are some steps that we've taken, but I know there's a lot more that we have to do.
Awesome. I was just thinking about our initial discussion when Maria, Mahak, and I met about this. We were trying to think about what we wanted to discuss, and it was just so interesting to look at the differences even within our own schools. I know that I attend a school in Kingston, and so it's a predominantly white community, and so we have different backgrounds and different populations at our school. And I know that our school has made a number of, I guess, more administrative changes, but then we've also seen changes amongst students as well in terms of discussion. So I actually met with our principal, who told us that our teachers all have equity goals that they're completing right now in terms of how to discuss equity in their classrooms and how to be equipped with ways to have those discussions in a comfortable manner, because a lot of teachers just haven't had that training before. So I think that's really great. And I know boards across Ontario have started equity training, equity plans, etc., for their teachers, for their staff, for their students as well. So I think that's really wonderful. And I know that we also have on our student council, we have this new position that's called an equity commissioner. So we have a senior and a junior equity commissioner, and they're just completely dedicated to bringing in equity in all of our discussions and student councils. For example, with Spirit Days, which there are a lot of, I guess, hidden inequities with Spirit Days that you wouldn't always think about, but a lot of socioeconomic barriers to participating in them. So that's been really great. And then in terms of discussions as well in class, I mean, I feel as though my class has done a 180 since last year. The text that we were talking about then and the text that we're discussing now, I feel as though we're a lot more, I really like this term, but we're a lot more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think that's so important in these discussions about equity, in these discussions about race as well, because I feel as though we kind of edged around the term of race. We didn't want to say the word racism. It was a bad word then, and it still is a bad word now, but it's something that we need to discuss because it's so prevalent in our communities. And it's so important that we're all taking action to be anti-racist and to be supporting our friends, our community in better ways. And so I think I've seen a lot of really great changes in my school, and those are just a few.
Emily, I'd love to hear where you're at right now.
Okay. Yeah, those are all really amazing. I'm thinking back and trying to figure out what my school is doing, even because what your schools are doing are like amazing, like EDI presentations, and I'm blown away because I don't know if my school is even doing this, and I'm like, why isn't my school doing this? One question that I have for you is, what actions can we take to support underrepresented communities? So any of you can. Oh.
And I think you have some resources laid out on the slide for us.
We do. Awesome. So the first resource that we want to,
I guess.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No, sorry. Okay.
No, that's all right. I just wanted to quickly mention the first EDI modules. I'm not sure if Maria, you're going to speak to that there. I think you might have cut it up for me a bit, but there are these modules that have been provided by headquarters, and those are ones that the council that I'm on produced last year, and I think that they're very informative, and they discuss a whole lot of concepts with equity, diversity, inclusion, from unconscious bias to microaggressions to how you can make your team more inclusive. So not just focusing on the equity and the diversity aspect, but as Mahak was saying, making sure that everyone feels included and feels safe and comfortable in your teams. So I highly recommend those modules. I know that there are a couple of them, and I have found them very informative. And then we also have a couple of books to mention here. So Maria, would you like to go on there?
Yeah, so we have 2 books mentioned here. Of course, there are a plethora of ones you can research, but these are the 2. So the first one is called The Skin We're In by Desmond. So this is he's actually a Toronto-based author, and this book is centered around Toronto specifically in 2017 and some events that were happening then, and kind of goes more into detail about systemic racism in Canadian institutions, because sometimes that discussion is left out and we more talk about racism on a larger scale, where we focus on racism in the United States, but it's also important to recognize the systemic racism in institutions that are also in Canada. And then Critical Race Theory by Lois Tyson. So this book kind of talks about critical race theory, which is the effects of race on one's social standing and effects in institutions such as like the legal system and political systems in society. So it goes more into depth on that topic.
And I think
and then do you want to talk about like other actions that people can take?
Yes, of course. So sorry for cutting you off there, but just like some of the last things that we have here is Ask School Admin. Namira gave an amazing example about how she went and talked to her principal. So some things that you can do is contact your local MPPs, brainstorm beforehand. If you're feeling a bit nervous, you can also go with a group of friends. And then the last part that we have is donations. So some important questions. Maria, do you want to maybe mention some important questions that we can ask when making sure that we're donating to the right places?
Sure. So some important things to consider when you're choosing where you want to donate to are kind of the credibility of the organization and like its reputability as well. Also considering like the scope of the people it supports. So is it on a local or a national level? And also some sustainable ways you can support this the organization. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a monetary way. It can be support them with your time, or it can be some in-kind donations, or whichever skills you have available at your disposal. Something to consider.
So those are some action items. So we really want to hear from you if you have any resources or steps that you've been taking or I guess to make yourself more aware. We would love to have that. So we're going to bring up a Menti really quickly, but you can go to menti.com and input the code that is 6864376 and basically answer the question that we have here is that what resources have supported your individual journey to allyship?
And while people are logging into the Menti, we'll let the answers accumulate. I just want to talk about what's going to go on next week, because we're almost at the end of the show. So we'll come back to the Menti. So people log on to menti.com 68 64 37 6 and talk about the resources that have supported your individual journey to allyship. But next week, Namira, you're going to be back, and we're going to be co-hosting the Recharge Your Bot award show, which is going to be a lot of excitement. We talked about Recharge Your Bot so many times on this show, so we're going to find out who all the winners are and see 18 different videos on the show. So that's going to be really exciting, and that'll be good. And hey, take a look. We've got some of these resources popping up, so you can talk more about them.
Oh, awesome. I see the girls in first weekend. I think that's actually where Emily, Mahak, Maria, and I all met for the first time. If anyone's not familiar with the Girls in First Weekend, this is something that was started a couple of years ago. Actually, Mahak, do you want to talk about this? Because I know that you sort of led it in its first couple of years.
Yeah, for sure. I think Maria was also one of the members on the Girls in STEM Executive
yes.
Advisory Council. But it was basically an amazing weekend where we had like this retreat for 2 days where a bunch of different girls from different FRC teams came together and worked on team building activities. We also had a lot of ED&I workshops. So we learned about the difference between micro and macro aggressions, which was the first time I ever discovered that word even exists. Maria, is there anything else that you want to add on?
Yeah, I think one part I also really remember is getting to talk to women in STEM and getting to talk to mentors. There was this one speed mentoring session that we did where we got to talk to a bunch of different women who had varying different positions in different companies. And I think that was, it really
I think we're having trouble with Maria's internet right now.
I think so too.
and I'm like, wow, there's so
But you know, we are wrapping up here, and so these are some great resources that people have listed. It's really exciting to see people talking about the influence that their mentors have had. Like Dr. Imogen Coe, who's almost like a First Canada mentor, the STEMathon, and this is really good stuff. And you know, we have a lot to talk about here because we've run over time. So clearly, we need to bring you back in the new year to talk more about equity, diversity, inclusion, and maybe we could do another terminology session, and we can make this a semi-regular thing as we learn about all of this. So thank you so much for being here. And we'll make sure that we get Maria's input whenever we get her internet fixed. It happens to everyone on the show at some point, right? You know, it happened to me in the pre-show, but this was really good stuff. Namira, Mahak, any final things you'd like to say on ED&I?
I think the only thing I'd say is that it's really important that EDI is a process. You'll never, or I've spoken with a lot of EDI experts who always say that they never reach this point where they're like, oh, I'm an expert now in EDI. It's just that they're, I guess, a bit farther along in that process than we are, just because they've been at it for longer, which is awesome. But it's so important to be uncomfortable in these discussions and to put yourself in the learning mindset. So I think that's all I'd say there, and that's something I've definitely been doing.
All right. Well, thank you so much to the panelists for being on. Emily, final things to wrap it up, my co-host.
I've missed co-hosting. Being behind the scenes, I don't get to connect with things as much. And although I am going to be behind the scenes more, I love co-hosting. And this was such an amazing show to come back and co-host for.
Well,
Like
I'll say this: we'll bring all four of you back as co-hosts in the new year. You just got to sign up. You know, we'll make it happen. Thank you so much. Everyone's awesome.